In 1980, a full year of American college tuition, room, board, all of it, cost about $10,000 in today's money. In 2026, that same year costs more than $30,000 on average, and at a private university, it can run past $45,000. Prices in general have roughly doubled since 1980. College has more than tripled. Here's the part that should worry every parent currently filling out a FAFSA form. The number of 18-year-olds who still think that trade is worth making is falling every single year, and it's been falling for over a decade. You'll hear people blame lazy teenagers. You'll hear people blame falling birth rates. Neither one holds up under a closer look. The real story is a deal that quietly stopped making sense, and almost nobody in charge wants to admit it. So here's the question we're actually answering today. If a college degree still pays off on average, and it does, why are so many capable young people opting out anyway? The answer isn't demographics, it isn't laziness, it's those three separate promises about price, about payoff, and about trust, all broken inside the same 40-year window. Once you see how they broke, you can't unsee it. To understand why the deal broke, you have to understand how good it used to be. After World War II, the GI Bill sent millions of returning veterans to college for free, and it built the largest, most educated middle class the country had ever produced. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and Washington panicked about falling behind in a technological race it hadn't seen coming. Congress responded with the National Defense Education Act, pouring federal money into student loans for the first time in American history. Then, in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Higher Education Act. It built the federal loan and grant system that still exists today. 7 years later, Pell Grants arrived, handing lower-income students money they never had to pay back. Keep that federal loan system in mind, because it matters a lot later. By the 1980s, all of this had created something remarkable. A 4-year degree was treated as close to a guarantee. By 1990, the median wage for a recent college graduate was already 38% higher than for a high school graduate, and that gap would keep climbing for years afterwards. Hold on to that percentage, because it matters a great deal later in this story. Wages were meaningfully higher for graduates, unemployment was lower, and enrollment climbed at a steady 2% a year for the next quarter century straight. Parents saved for it from the day their child was born. Banks were happy to lend against it without hesitation. By the end of the 20th century, most American families considered a college degree one of the most important purchases they would ever make, right up there with a house. If you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of story we tell here, the ones that financial headlines rarely slow down long enough to actually explain. Hit subscribe before we get into how the whole arrangement started falling apart. That confidence lasted for decades. Through the 80s and 90s, going to college wasn't really treated as a decision anymore. It was closer to a rite of passage. Enrollment kept rising, tuition was still manageable, and universities kept building new dormitories and research wings to keep up with demand. Nobody was asking whether the underlying math still worked, because for most of the 20th century it clearly did. But underneath all that confidence, a handful of decisions had already been made in Washington that would quietly rewire the entire system. Nobody felt it yet. That's the part that makes it interesting. But then something changed, and it started with a single budget in 1981. That year, the newly elected Reagan administration pushed two pieces of legislation through Congress, the Graham-Latta budget and the Kemp-Roth tax cut. Together, they cut federal spending on higher education by roughly 25% in a single presidential term. Pell Grants, the money meant specifically for the poorest students, barely moved, inching from $2.4 billion in 1980 to $2.8 billion by 1984. It didn't come close to keeping pace with rising costs. Here's the twist. While grant money for poor students flatlined, the federal government's guaranteed student loan program did the opposite. It nearly tripled in the same 4 years, growing from $2.9 billion in 1980 to almost $8 billion by 1984. Remember that loan system Lyndon Johnson built back in 1965? This is where it started getting used very differently from its intended. By 1987, Reagan's own education secretary, William Bennett, pointed out something uncomfortable. Federal financial aid to students had climbed 57% since 1980. Inflation over the same stretch was 26%. Bennett's theory was simple, and it stuck around for decades afterwards. The easier it became to borrow, the less pressure colleges felt to keep prices down, because the money would show up either way. The universities didn't disagree quietly. They just kept raising prices. Tuition at public four-year colleges shot up more than 140% during the 1980s alone. Private school tuition rose even faster, over 160% in the same 10 years. And state governments, watching Washington pull back, quietly began pulling back too. It's worth sitting with why this worked so well for so long. A university doesn't lose customers the way a normal business does when it raises its price. Families weren't paying cash up front. They were signing loan paperwork, and the federal government was standing behind almost all of it. Raise tuition by $1,000, and the loan simply grew by $1,000 too. There was no real customer pushback built into the system because the bill didn't come due until years later, long after the enrollment decision had already been made. So what was actually happening underneath all those tuition increases? States were slowly walking away from public universities, and nobody was announcing it as policy. In 2003, state and federal money still covered about 68.5% of what it actually cost to run a public university. By 2020, that had fallen to just over 56%. Every year that gap widened, someone had to cover the difference, that someone was the student and the loan officer was standing next to them. Years later, one of the men who helped build the modern student loan industry had a change of heart about the whole arrangement. Our Lord ran Sallie Mae, the company that pioneered federal student lending, and for years he genuinely believed he was helping families invest in their futures. Then he joined the board of Penn State and watched the university's operating budget balloon toward nearly $8 billion a year, with tuition for two of his own grandchildren running as high as $75,000 annually. He came to a hard conclusion. The easy money hadn't made college more accessible. It had made colleges bloated, and it had quietly shifted the entire bill onto families year after year, with nobody stepping in to stop it. By the time anyone in Washington seriously questioned the arrangement, an entire generation had already borrowed its way through it. The total cost of a year of college, adjusted for inflation, had gone from roughly $10,000 in 1980 to over $30,000 today. That's not a rounding error. That's the entire foundation of the deal shifting under everyone's feet, one tuition bill at a time. So what did 4 decades of rising prices and easy borrowing actually produce? Debt. A staggering, historically unprecedented amount of it. In 2003, total student loan debt in the United States stood at about $243 billion. By early 2026, according to the Federal Reserve, that figure had climbed to nearly $1.9 trillion. That's roughly 4 times what it was just 20 years earlier. More than 42 million Americans currently carry some piece of it, with an average balance north of $39,000 in federal loans alone. The numbers get worse the closer you look. Even after adjusting for inflation, the average debt a student graduates with has grown 41% since 2007. Before adjusting for inflation, is up over 100%. The typical new graduate now carries a debt-to-income ratio of nearly 60%, well above what any lender would call healthy for a mortgage. It isn't only students carrying this weight either. A meaningful slice of that debt, close to 7% of the total, sits on the shoulders of parents who took out Parent Plus loans on behalf of their kids, betting their own retirement on someone else's diploma. Not only did the debt pile up, but it also started defaulting at rates nobody expected. By the end of 2025, almost 8 million borrowers had defaulted on a combined $181 billion in federal loans. Another 3 million were at least 3 months behind on payments. Combined, that's the highest rate of serious delinquency and default the federal loan program has ever recorded, and collections on defaulted loans, including wage garnishment, only resumed in 2025 after a long pandemic-era pause. On top of that, one of the main safety nets borrowers had leaned on, income-driven repayment through the SAVE plan, was struck down by the courts in early 2026, right as a new law reshaped repayment all over again. But here's the strange part. Debt alone doesn't explain why enrollment keeps falling. Millions of Americans who have already paid off every dollar of their student loans will tell you the same thing if you ask them. Getting the degree was never really the hard part, it's what happened afterwards that nobody warned them about. So what happened afterwards? The payoff itself started quietly breaking down. Economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco track the wage gap between college graduates and high school graduates over the past 20 years and found something that should have been front-page news. The gap hasn't grown. In 2023, it was actually slightly lower than it had been back in 2000. Meanwhile, the cost of that same degree had climbed 40% since the early 2000s. One of the researchers on the project, Robert Valletta, put the problem plainly. When the wage advantage of a degree stays flat, while the price of that degree keeps rising, the actual financial return to college shrinks a little more every single year. It gets stranger. In 2010, job postings requiring a college degree outnumbered postings that didn't require one by a ratio of 12 to 10. By 2020, that ratio had flipped, down to 6 to 10. Employers were quietly asking for degrees less often, even as more Americans than ever were graduating with one. Companies noticed the shifting mood and started announcing the end of the degree requirement everywhere, from Google to IBM to entire state governments. 85% of employers told LinkedIn they now prioritize skills over degrees. It sounded like a genuine reset for millions of workers without a diploma. Then Harvard Business School and the Burning Glass Institute actually checked the hiring data behind all those announcements. Fewer than 1 in 700 actual hires had anything to do with those policy changes. On paper, this looked like real progress. It wasn't. Nearly half the companies making the announcement hadn't changed a single thing about who they actually hired. They had only changed the wording of the job posting. Meanwhile, nearly 1.1 million different credentials now exist across the country, more entries than the Oxford English Dictionary, and according to the Burning Glass Institute, only about 12% of them actually lead to a meaningfully higher paycheck. And this is where the story gets stranger still, because on top of all of that, artificial intelligence arrived in the job market at the worst possible moment for anyone holding a fresh diploma. Entry-level job postings in the United States are down 35% since 2023, and in software and data roles specifically, down by as much as 67%. Researchers at Stanford tracked workers aged 22 to 25 in the occupations most exposed to AI, including software development, customer service and accounting, and found their employment had dropped 16% in under 3 years. By December 2025, nearly 43% of college graduates between 22 and 27 were working jobs that never required a degree in the first place, the highest share since the pandemic. For the first time in decades, unemployment among recent graduates, at 5.6%, is now higher than unemployment for the country as a whole, at 4.3%. Anthropic's own chief executive has publicly warned that as much as half of entry-level white-collar work could disappear within the next few years, with unemployment in some sectors spiking into the double digits. It isn't a total wipeout, to be fair. ZipRecruiter found that 77% of recent graduates landed a job within 3 months of finishing school this year, actually up from 63% the year before, but the jobs themselves pay less than expected. Current students expect to earn around $80,000 in their first year out. The real average starting salary sits closer to $56,000, so the price kept climbing, the payoff went flat, and now the first rung of the career ladder is disappearing entirely, right as this generation needs it the most. So here's where all of it lands. Undergraduate enrollment peaked in 2010 at 18.1 million students. By 2022, it sat nearly 15% below that peak, and it has only partially recovered since. The colleges themselves are starting to disappear. More than 80 private non-profit colleges have closed or merged since 2020. Over 52,000 students have been displaced along the way. Hampshire College in Massachusetts announced its shutdown for this year. Siena Heights University in Michigan is closing its doors in June, after losing as much as 70% of its enrollment in a single decade. Ohio State eliminated 8 majors outright. Oklahoma eliminated 41. Even elite universities aren't immune. Stanford cut hundreds of positions. Northwestern cut hundreds more. USC cut over 900 jobs in a single year. Researchers at the Hetchinger report estimate that more than 400 private colleges are at real risk of closing within the next 10 years. Huron Consulting puts the number of students who could ultimately be affected at 600,000, with $18 billion in endowment money needing to be redistributed or simply written off entirely. None of this is landing evenly either. The West has seen enrollment fall over 7%, the Northeast almost 7%, the Midwest over 6%, while the South and parts of the Sun Belt keep growing. Falling birth rates after the 2007 recession are real, and they're about to make the incoming class of 18-year-olds smaller, no matter what happens with cost or trust. But birth rates don't explain why the students who do exist are choosing trade schools, the military, or straight into the workforce in growing numbers. That choice is about the deal, not the headcount. And trust collapsed right alongside the buildings. In 2015, 57% of Americans told Gallup they had real confidence in higher education. By 2023, that number had fallen to 36%. It has barely recovered since. Back in 2010, 75% of Americans called a college degree very important. By 2025, only 35% still did. The empire didn't fall all at once. It just kept charging more, delivering less for 4 decades straight, and hoping nobody would notice the widening gap. Eventually everybody noticed. So what's the real reason no one wants to go to college anymore? It comes down to 3 broken promises. First, the price stopped matching reality. A year of college now costs 3 times what it did in 1980, after adjusting for inflation, while everyday prices only doubled over the same stretch. Second, the payoff stopped being guaranteed. The wage advantage of a degree flattened for 20 straight years. Employers quietly asked for degrees less often, and then artificial intelligence started eating the entry-level jobs that used to justify taking the risk in the first place. Third, trust broke, and once trust breaks at scale, it doesn't come back just because tuition freezes for a single year. To be fair, the data isn't entirely bleak. College graduates still earn roughly 60% more than high school graduates on average, according to the College Board, and most still recoup the cost of their degree by their mid-30s. Only about 4% of college graduates end up living in poverty, compared with well over double that for people who never finished high school. For most people, most of the time, college still pays off. What's gone is the certainty. What's gone is the unconditional bet that used to make the decision automatic. The one where you enrolled first and worried about the return later. And once a bet stops being automatic, people start doing the math for themselves, one FAFSA form at a time, one job posting at a time. That's exactly what's happening right now, all across the country, and it's why the dorm rooms keep getting a little emptier every single fall. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the honest kind that financial media rarely slows down long enough to actually tell, subscribe, because there's more of it coming. And speaking of bets that used to be automatic, Washington just eliminated Grad Plus loans, the program that let over 1.5 million graduate students borrow whatever it cost to finish their degree, no questions asked. That safety net disappeared in July of this year. Next time, we're going to look at exactly what happens to the graduate school pipeline when the government stops guaranteeing the loan and starts asking whether the degree was ever worth the risk in the first place.